An employment tribunal ruled on Wednesday that Maya Forstater suffered direct discrimination when the Centre for Global Development, where she was a visiting fellow, did not renew her contract. Forstater lost her job after tweeting that transgender women could not change their biological sex. She brought a test case to establish that gender-critical views are protected under the Equality Act, losing that case in 2019 before she was successful in an appeal last year. The case was sent back to the tribunal, who this week upheld 2 complaints of direct discrimination and 1 of victimisation. 2 other complaints of direct discrimination and 1 of victimisation were unsuccessful. Maya Forstater, welcome to Free Speech Nation.
Thank you.
So, this has been such a long process, and I have to say, you know, a lot of media outlets haven't really covered this particularly well. So do you want to take us right back to what's happened at the start and talk us through it?
Yes. So, autumn 2018, this really started. The government was consulting on reform to the Gender Recognition Act, the idea of self-ID. I was working at a think tank. I thought I should be allowed to think about this.
It's a think tank.
Yes,
right?
exactly. And it was a think tank where they didn't take institutional positions, non-partisan, encouraged debate and disagreement. In fact, I got the job there by disagreeing with them about something. So,
right.
So I sort of thought I had a duty to use my voice, which was, you know, sort of 2,000 followers on Twitter, not huge, but I could see that there were people being bullied and silenced, and then there were people like Kathleen Stock speaking up, and it took me about a year of following the debates on sex and gender before I got to the point where I felt like, OK, I know what I think, I'm not a bigot, I've got something to say, and I shouldn't be stopped from saying it. So I tweeted in September 2018 the most boring 4 tweets you've ever written.
Don't do yourself down.
Well, no, I mean, it took me a couple of hours to get up the courage to write them, and it was sort of like, the government is having a consultation about gender self-ID, this matters,
yes.
Here's something to read. You know, they were boring.
But you were essentially saying that, you know, in the reforms to the Gender Recognition Act, there are implications for women's rights. Right,
and that the government is asking for our opinion on it. So, you know, you shouldn't be frightened of giving your opinion when the government's asking us for it. But even so, it took me a couple of hours to sort of get up the courage to write those, and then nothing happened. So I tweeted them, no response. And I was sort of getting more and more concerned and angry about the issue. At the time, Karen White, the rapist, was put in a women's prison. So I started tweeting stories like that were in the news, still getting no response from my followers, who were sort of 2,000 policy wonks, basically, who usually will argue about things. And so about a month into tweeting about it, there was a story about this guy called Philip Bunce, who works at Credit Suisse. He's a banker at Credit Suisse, a married man, sometimes goes to work in a dress and a wig and calls himself Pips on the days when he goes to work in a dress and wig. And he'd been given this award for women in business. So obviously...
So he'd won an award,
yes,
as a woman?
As a woman, for women. And he doesn't even claim to be a woman. He just likes to be called Pips and wear a wig.
Right.
So he'd been given this award for women in business, and obviously there was sort of a Twitter storm about that. And so I thought, well, I mean, I was angry about it, but I also thought I'll use this as an opportunity to start a discussion. So I worked in international development, which is quite woke, and one of the things that guys in international development do is say, if I get invited to a conference to speak on a panel and it's all men, I will say to the organisers, can you not find a woman?
Yeah. And
I'll step down. You know, it's a good thing. It's a way of saying women also know about things.
Sure.
And it's a personal pledge. So I asked this question to my followers and said, if you were asked to be on a panel with 2 other guys and Pips Bunce, would you still say, can you find a woman? And it was a way of sort of bringing it down to a very personal level, because otherwise people go, oh, it's sports, the sports bodies will work it out, or prison
yes.
authorities, you know, somebody else. It's difficult and scary, and I don't want to talk about this.
Yes.
And so I sort of wanted to bring it to a personal question. And it sparked this conversation. So for about 10 days, you know, my Twitter feed went quite busy. And all of these people, some who I knew and some who I didn't, answered me, mainly disagreeing, but politely. And
you wanted this conversation,
yes,
right.
Exactly, and in detail. And we sort of unpicked, well, you know, why? I mean, I was so surprised that there were people saying, well, if if he thinks he's a woman part of the time, then maybe he is or she is, and
so he's a woman part of the time.
Yes.
Okay.
So the discussion went on, and there was sort of 10 days worth of tweets, and what I didn't realise was, so the organisation I worked for, I was in London, but the headquarters was in Washington DC, and this conversation sort of set alarm bells ringing in Washington, and a couple of young female staff went in and complained to HR and said, we're concerned she's making transphobic tweets.
Right.
So I had no idea that this was happening, and then I got an email from HR saying, please, we'd prefer you not to use exclusionary language, and please put a disclaimer on your tweet.
How did you feel about that, being accused of transphobia, hate, exclusionary? I mean, how did that make you feel?
I was surprised. I mean, I knew when I started, as I said, I was nervous talking about it, but because the organisation I worked for was generally sort of robust, I didn't expect it from them. And so I responded. I mean, I put a disclaimer on my tweets because that's fair enough. It was my own views, not the organisation's, absolutely. And I responded with a sort of email setting out why the concept of women excludes men. And, it's you have to be exclusionary to have categories that work.
Yes.
And sort of thought, oh, well, that'll sort it. And what I didn't know, and I didn't know this till quite long after, was there were chains of emails and meetings and investigations and all kinds of things going on in Washington. I just put the disclaimer on my tweets and sort of carried on.
So, I mean, then, of course, you lose the job and you appeal this decision. And what happened at that stage? So
it took about 6 months for me to lose my job from that point of tweeting. And what happened was, so when you go to court, you get disclosures. So eventually you get all of the emails that you didn't see at the time.
Oh, so you saw all this stuff?
Yeah, so at the time, I didn't know what was going on, but eventually I found out what was going on, which was they were panicking. And they had a group of consultants who were doing EDI training, so they asked the consultants to help them. Big mistake.
Right.
The consultants then did an investigation on me, looked at my tweets and told them, these tweets are transphobic. And I didn't see the report at the time. And when I did see it eventually, when I went to court, it said things like, Maya Forstater follows Kathleen Stock. And everyone knows Kathleen Stock is a terrible transphobe because, look, these 50 people have written a letter to her university saying she's a terrible transphobe.
So this is very defamatory. It's like as though the accusation is all the evidence that's needed.
Yes, exactly. And the organisation that I worked for, I think they felt like, if they would then say to the EDI consultants, well, we're not sure if this is, is this just a nuanced argument or is it transphobic, then the finger would be pointed to them.
Yes.
So sort of once you've started down this road, everything collapses into it because nobody can say, no, that's not transphobic, because it becomes obvious that if you say that, then you'll be the witch as well. So then I lost my job and I tweeted about it, as you do. And what I didn't know was that there were a group of feminist lawyers who'd sort of thought about my case before it existed. So they'd thought about this idea of belief discrimination.
Yes.
And they were waiting for a case. So
then they were able to support you in this?
Yes.
So just so that we move through the timeline, you've lost the job, you appeal it now because you have this support now, that your beliefs should be protected in law. But what did the appeal judge say?
Well, no. So first I went to the employment tribunal.
Yes.
8 days after tweeting, we put in a claim to the employment tribunal. And the first part of that was a preliminary hearing just on this question of belief. Is the belief that sex is real protected under the Equality Act? So religions and beliefs, any kind of religion or philosophical belief, like Scottish nationalism, ethical veganism, there are a whole bunch. There's not a list, there's not a master list, but they get tested. So if you bring a case for belief discrimination, they test it against these criteria. Is it serious? Is it coherent? Does it destroy other people's human rights? So I had to have this belief
But that seems strange because it's not a belief, it's a fact, isn't it?
It is, but the whole belief was that sex is real immutable and important. So it's
Right,
not
I
just
see.
kind of the biology,
Yes.
If you get down to it, most people will agree with you on biology, but then they'll say, some people say, well, gender identity matters more.
Yes.
So it was that the whole package, so you could say that's a belief, and went to court to show that belief doesn't destroy other people's human rights and is coherent and is serious, and lost.
Yes, and the judge used a particular phrase, which I thought was a bit
Yes.
chilling. What was that
Well,
phrase?
not worthy of respect in a democratic society.
I mean, that's astonishing.
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, he didn't make that up. That's part of the test. So,
Yes.
So it's basically, if your belief is Nazism or fascism, then it's not a protected belief. That kind of belief is not worthy of respect.
But the belief
almost anything else is.
The belief that you were promoting here, this idea that, that acknowledgement of biological reality is important for safeguarding, for women's only spaces, domestic violence refuge centres, that kind of thing. How could that fall into the same category as Nazism?
I know. It was absolutely stunning. And part of what happened, I think, is that the judges are trained. So they have this thing called the Equal Treatment Bench Book, which is not the law, but it's what they tell judges about how to run an inclusive courtroom. And
Yes.
lots of that is good stuff. But it has a great big chapter on transgender, which is basically, if not written by Stonewall, it could have been. And it tells them that the law is old-fashioned and that they should use different terminology. And so what I was saying was I lost my job for saying the definition of sex in law. I mean,
Right. Wow.
That's authoritarian. And the judge was working off a different guidebook.
But now the outcome has come your way.
Yeah.
Finally, after all this time. I mean, how long's it been?
3 years.
So, and of course, you've been very much under the spotlight. J.K. Rowling, of course, has very famously supported you. But with that, of course, has come a lot of attention, which was helpful, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, it was amazing. That she tweeted the day after I lost the first time. So, you can imagine if I was thinking, should I appeal or not? And then J.K. Rowling tweeted,
Yes.
I was appealing. And it's been amazing to have her support. But it also meant that because people wanted to to say that she was acting in bad faith and lying, they therefore had to say that I was.
Yes.
And so they used me to kind of try and undermine her. So I've had a lot of attention from
Do you
all
think?
sorts.
Do you think it's because? I mean, as you said earlier, there was an element of intimidation. You said yourself you thought a long time before having the bravery to tweet out your views on this. A lot of thank goodness for the few prominent women in society who are sticking their necks out. But a lot of people are scared, and isn't that understandable?
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, it's sort of like getting into cold water. Once you're in, you're in.
Yeah.
But it's the people who are sort of on the edge. You can see why, people kind of put their toe in, as Macy Gray did this week,
Right.
and get pounced on and intimidated to the point where they just say, this is not worth blowing up my life for.
Yes.
And that's really done to kind of police the space and stop people talking about it.
But your case is so important because it is now established as a precedent in law that this is a protected belief, which will hopefully mean that whenever women will feel more comfortable expressing this belief.
Yeah, women and men. And I mean, already from when I won the appeal, I've heard from so many women, particularly, who've said, this has helped them at work. They kind of say my name, and it makes HR investigations go away, or at least makes them think twice. So even if people don't get to court, it's helping to make that space where they can speak more freely.
And how does it feel when being the centre of this storm, having people accuse you of these awful things? I mean, I've seen people say things about gender-critical feminists, that they're the same as Nazis, the same as fascists, and just essentially hateful. But your view of trans people isn't hateful.
No, I mean, it's awful. You get used to being abused on a daily basis, and you start to think that's normal, and have people lie about you and make up stories and call you the most awful things. And after a while, to cope with it, you just think, well, that's normal.
Yeah.
But it's not.
So how do we move beyond that? How can we? Is it through the law ultimately that we're going to have to address this?
I think it's partly through the law, and it's through it's got to be through institutions getting their purpose back. I mean, the think tank that I worked for wasn't a social justice think tank. This wasn't what it did. It could have not gone this way if it had kept its eye on its purpose, which was, evidence-based policy.
Yes.
And if it had had leadership to say, no, we're not going down a witch hunt. And we've seen that, like Reading University recently, they had this big pile-on saying, you mustn't have this gender-critical professor in to give a lecture.
Yes.
And the Vice-Chancellor just said, no,
yes.
we're here for freedom of speech. It takes the law, but it also takes leadership and it takes institutions finding their purpose and their mission.
It doesn't help, does it, though, that groups like Stonewall say no debate is the element to this, whereas in your case what was very interesting is finally people were on the stand having to answer the questions about gender identity ideology that they've just fudged in the past.
Yes.
That was a particularly interesting thing to read.
Yes, yeah, it was, it was like the Scopes trials. It was, and there were 4 witnesses from the Centre for Global Development, all from the US, and they looked like they were giving evidence against the mafia, basically. They had to present the gender ideology view, and you could see that across the 4 of them there were different degrees of buy-in.
Yes.
But if you don't demonstrate buy-in, then the kind of people watching would paint them with the same things that they painted me.
And finally, because we're out of time now, but I do want to ask you finally, what is your advice to people who are in your situation, who are getting pressure from HR or managers or whatever, and they feel, well, maybe I should just shut up and go along with it and use my pronouns in my email signature and say that gender is more important than biological sex. What's your advice to those people?
I don't tell people to go and blow up their life. Not everyone can do that. But, you do have protection of, use your organisational policies, use your whistleblowing policy, put things in writing, don't swear, do it as politely as you can, but say what you need to say. And, lots of people go through questions and investigations and they do go away, and we don't see that because it's sort of under the waterline. So, I wouldn't tell people to say nothing, but at the same time, they don't have to go kamikaze.
Yes, absolutely. Well, however hard it's been, I think what you've done is incredibly important, and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maya Forstater, everyone.